Hello, I'm John Garvin, and welcome to a new episode in my series on oil painting. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my newest painting called A Spear Tip Wedding in Ancient Persia. This is based on a story by Karl Barks, which he wrote and drew in 1949. It's one of his most iconic stories called Donald Duck in Ancient Persia. A classic Barks story, it follows Donald and the nephews as they're kidnapped by a mad scientist who drags them off to a remote desert in the Middle East to an ancient buried city called Itzafeka. It seems that the city's inhabitants had discovered a way to live forever by putting themselves through a drying process. The scientist, thinking this is a great idea, brings them back to life so he can discover their secrets. The king, Nevawaza, is on a rampage because his daughter, Princess Nidabara-Sopa, was jilted at the altar by Prince Cad Ali Cad, who, by sheer coincidence, looks exactly like Donald Duck. Mayhem and confusion ensues. The plot device of mistaken identity is hardly new. Plautus used it in the Menachmi, circa 200 BC, and of course, Shakespeare borrowed the idea for his Comedy of Errors in 1594. If Shakespeare can borrow a plot device, then surely Karl Barks can. And it was a popular story. We don't have exact sales records of Dell's comics, but one source reports that by 1953, Dell was selling 23 million copies a month. It's safe to say that worldwide, millions of readers bought and read Barks's comic books. Many of those readers became his lifelong fans. In 1965, he retired from Western publishing and began a second career painting landscapes and Native American scenes, which he would take to local shows with his wife and fellow artist, Gary. I cover his output from these years in my book, Karl Barks Paintings and Drawings, 1966 to 1971. Then, in 1971, decades after he wrote and drew his most popular duck stories, Barks received permission to do a series of Disney paintings based on them, including subjects like the cover of Ancient Persia. From 1971 to 1973, Barks completed 4 of these, each slightly different and each showing a progression and refinement of his technique in handling detail, palette, and lighting. In 1997, Barks would revisit the subject for a colored pencil drawing titled In the Long Ago and Far Away. But while Barks would paint his most popular covers over and over again, he seldom did paintings of the stories themselves. On occasion, he would take a particularly detailed or dramatic panel from a famous story, like this one from Uncle Scrooge 4-color number 386, Only a Poor Old Man, or this one from Uncle Scrooge number 25, The Flying Dutchman, and make paintings of them. But these examples were rare. This is because Barks felt a painting should be complete and understandable in and of itself. Partly this desire is based on the books on composition he studied when teaching himself to paint, and partly it's because of his training as a gag artist at Disney in the 1930s, where he mastered the storyboard art of telling a story with a single image. I go into a lot more detail on the narrative aspect of cartoon paintings in my book, After Karl Barks, Painting Fine Art Cartoons in Oils. So, after I finished my last painting, Raiders of the Lost Ankh, and I was thinking of ideas for my next Barks-inspired duck painting, I came back to one of my favorite stories, Donald Duck in Ancient Persia. I already had a basic idea what the painting would be about. I wasn't worried the way Barks had been about whether the painting told a story in a single image. The only people who would ever care about my duck paintings were already very familiar with Barks's Ancient Persia, so I just dug into the composition itself. I knew I wanted the painting to be a sprawling narrative that showed off the setting and characters created by Barks. The dark buried city of Itzafeka, the colorful characters, the mad scientist, King Nevawaza, Princess Nidabara-Sopa, the King's Guard, and of course, Donald's doppelganger, Cad Ali Cad. Having 2 Donald Ducks in the painting would be one of its highlights. Where possible, I would use Barks's drawings directly for authenticity. From his paintings, I would borrow his elaborate Persian lantern and his jade lion statues. But I would do a bunch of my own research as well, the same way Barks would. While Barks had an immense library of books and National Geographics, I have something at least as good: the internet. It wasn't hard to find all kinds of reference for authentic details, from wall sculptures and friezes to carpets and costumes. With all this material in hand, I was ready to start working on the composition. Based on books and sketches I found in the Barks estate, he used a composition method called dynamic symmetry, which was a way of dividing up the panel so that different elements were presented in the most dynamic way possible. Again, I go into this in a lot more detail in my book. Using diagonal guidelines to help him place props and characters, Barks would use his light table and tracing paper to get everything exactly where he wanted it. While I like to draw as much as any cartoonist, because of my background in video games for the last 30 years, I'm much faster working digitally. I use 3D Max with virtual sets and mannequins to play with layouts, character placement, and lighting. And I use Photoshop as I get closer to finding a composition I like. Here you can see that I've settled on elements I want to use. The nephews dragging Cad Ali Cad back into the buried city, and King Nebuchadnezzar holding Donald by the neck. But I haven't decided on a final layout yet, and these just weren't clicking with me. Then I got the idea of using an extra wide format, a panel 12 inches by 30 inches. Barks had used this format several times in his landscape and Native American paintings, but only once in his Disney compositions. For this painting, set in ancient Colchis, I decided it would be perfect for my painting of ancient Persia. The wide format would allow me to include the befuddled mad scientist, the petulant-looking king's guard, the nephews dragging Cad Ali Cad back into Itzafeka, and Princess Nidabara Sopa grasping lustily for her hapless suitor held in place by King Nebuchadnezzar. Now that the composition was, for the most part, complete, I could begin working on the painting itself. This is the Photoshop final composition and layout, a mishmash of Barks drawings and research photos. At this stage, it's kinda a mess, and it's probably hard to tell what's going on. But it's not meant to be seen by anyone but me. It's a working file that I print out and use to transfer to my Masonite panel, which I'm now ready to do. Here is how the layout image looks transferred to the panel. While it's certainly not a polished drawing, it does what it needs to, which is provide a blueprint for the final painting. When I turn on the dynamic symmetry diagonal lines, you get a better idea of how the composition works. On the far left, isolated from the others, is the mad scientist, reading his copy of Up and Atom. Then we follow the center diagonal line down through the king's guards on the left, and see that Cad Ali Cad and the nephews are on the stairs above the center line to help fill in that space. Above where the center and right diagonal lines meet is the composition's focal point, and here we find the princess, Donald, and the king. And then finally, off to the right, more of the king's guards to balance out the composition. Note that nothing is centered. The Persian lamp is centered between Donald and the princess, not the center of the painting. And vertically, visual elements are placed either above or below the center line. Using diagonal lines like this helps keep everything asymmetrical, and that's what makes Barks-style compositions so entertaining and alive. One more quick note: even though the drawing is complete, I will make changes during the painting process. I'll talk more about these in a moment, but just want to point out that I ditched the dog noses, for example, and went for full-on cartoon human faces. In several interviews, Barks talked about how he preferred drawing humans and having the ducks interact with real human beings. But his editors at Western were like, nope, stop that. Also, some details I either simplified or got rid of, like these wall sculptures going on back here in the shadow area. And I changed the princess's hands quite a bit. While this tracing is faithful to Barks's comic panel, when it came time to paint her hands, it just didn't work. It was hard to tell what was a finger or a fold of flesh. And in the end, I didn't like how one of her arms disappeared behind Donald. It made for confusing storytelling, so I changed it while I was painting. Which, now that the drawing was transferred to the panel, I was ready to start. Here, after a few days' work, is the underpainting. I've talked at length in previous episodes about my technique for doing an underpainting, so I'm not going to go into much detail here. The main point is that I'm not focused on color at all, since everything is painted using monochromatic hues and values. Instead, I'm focused on the lighting. I want the buried city of Itzafeka to feel dark and gloomy, lit only by the central Persian lantern. With the exception of the mad scientist's small lamp, all the light emanates from this one light source and spills outward, creating dramatic lighting for the focal point of the Princess, Donald, and the King, and spotlighting Cad Ali Cad and the nephews. The lighting also helps frame the painting because the King's guards on both sides can sort of slip into the shadows and alcoves. Note that I still haven't fixed the dog faces or the princess's hands. It was at this stage that I decided to make these changes. And I hadn't yet decided on what I was going to do with the shadows cast by the princess and the king, but that would be coming. Finally, at this stage, I decided I didn't like some of the cartoon faces I had drawn and painted into the side walls, and decided I would have to change them into something more realistic and based on research. I would get to that soon, but for now, the underpainting was done. When starting a new painting, I usually begin with what I think are going to be the biggest challenges. In this case, the princess, king, and guards. I start by laying in base colors and using photo reference, trying to get the folds of the cloth on their robes to look just right. At this point, I decide to redo the princess's hands, and I use my own hands as models. I don't know if this is how Barks would have done it, but the sight of her reaching out with her short stubby arms and grasping fingers made me laugh. So I think Barks might have been okay with it. And I've started working on their faces. You can see the dog noses are gone. I love the expressions of haughty disdain Barks put on the king and guards, but it would take some work before I would be happy with Princess Nita Barasopa's nose and face. Next, I lay in the basic golds. As I talk about in my book, I learned this recipe for creating believable gold from Barks himself. On a visit in the early 80s, I'd taken several of my paintings to show him, including a copy of one of his money bin paintings. He gave me a lot of great feedback, including how my gold coins looked more like wood chips because I'd used burnt sienna. He gave me his palette recipe, which he had spent weeks developing in the 1970s. Barks used a mixture of cadmium yellow and Mars violet to achieve a rich range of golden hues. At this point, I also started thinking about what I was going to do with the carpet and shadows, and laid in the base color for those. And then I just keep working at it. Weeks later, I've mostly completed the main characters and the background stonework, including redoing those faces on the walls I mentioned earlier. I've got the jade lions in and have decided to add green to the Persian lantern and carpet to help balance them out. Now all the base color layers are in, next is refining details. I use Midjourney so I can try to get the lighting correct on the mad scientist's shirt, his equipment, and all the pottery. Then I just work my way across the panel, putting detail into the velvet drapes, sandals and toes and carpet, all of the stonework one brick at a time. And by adding a little comic makeup and a hedgehog haircut, I finally begin to like the way the princess looks. And I'm really beginning to like the way all the characters, with their bright primary colors, are popping off the background. Then finally, after weeks of work, the painting is complete. Overall, I'm really happy with how it turned out. I like how an important element I borrowed from Barks's paintings, the Persian lantern, draws our eye as the central light source. I love the dramatic shadows it casts, which make the princess even larger and heavier in the frame. Of course, everything that makes the painting successful came from Carl Barks. The look on Donald's face, the nephew's dogged determination to save their uncle, the look of horror on Cad Ali Cad as he sees the fate that awaits him, the overall ambience of the magnificent buried city of Itzafeka. All of that is Carl Barks. But I was more than happy to spend a few weeks bringing his vision to life in a new way. A few final notes. Just because a painting is finished doesn't mean the work is complete. Picking out a frame is super important. Barks and his wife Gary used hand-picked frames for all of their paintings, usually opting for sturdy Western-style carved wooden frames with linen liners. I own 2 of Carl's originals, and both have these hand-picked frames. For my painting, because of its 12 by 30 inch size, I had to special order a frame from a shop in Eugene, Oregon, right over the mountains from where I live. And it's amazing. Heavy, solid wood with a beautiful linen liner. The craftsmanship is spectacular. Next, I have to add the painting's information to the back of the panel. Carl and Gary both did this, writing down the painting's title, ID number, and sometimes the painting size and medium, along with their artist card or stamp. In fact, if someone ever offers to sell you a Carl or Gary original painting, ask to see the verso, or the reverse side of the painting. If this handwritten information is not there, it's probably not an original by the Barkses. They would then enter this same information into their ledgers, where they kept accurate records for each completed painting. Again, having gone digital, I keep my records in Excel, where each year it's really more of an accusatory finger showing how few paintings I got done this year. Next, I apply a layer of varnish to protect the surface of the painting. Sometimes I'll brush this on, other times I use spray like this. I prefer Damar gloss varnish because it brings out the richness of the oil colors, but sometimes the Barkses would use a matte finish. Last but not least, I'll have a metal plaque engraved with the painting's title and other information. Again, this is something Barks would do because a painting's title would often contribute greatly to the overall presentation. In my case, the pun on shotgun wedding adds context for those who don't know the story, and an extra smile for those who do. The phrase "after Carl Barks," like the title of my book, pays homage and gives credit to the artist who inspired the painting. Okay, that's it for this episode. Try to remember that as a creator, any kind of creator, whether you're making music, writing, crafts, landscaping, anything, that the joy comes in the act of creation itself. For me, it's taking a blank sheet of masonite like this one and turning it into something like this. An original work of art that, if I hadn't made it, would not exist. And to this day, though, even though I've been doing this for going on 45 years now, I still find the ability to hold something in my hand that never existed until I created it to be just an immense source of pleasure. So until next time, keep creating, and I'll see you then.